Hello everyone, today we introduce the figure of Gaius Iulius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula, under the historiographical criticism that surely has made of him, of all the Julio-Claudians, the worst emperor in a certain sense, an emperor that, starting from Augustus is the third one, right, after Tiberius, and that ruled for not even 4 years, and about which we know the least, basically, of all the Julio-Claudians, and that is an astonishingly fascinating figure for a number of reasons we'll list today. It's also one of my favorite emperors. I often pointed out that the Julio-Claudians were actually all good emperors in practice, and that, of course, they suffered of this bad press, or let's say handwriting for the time, that indeed today is not considered as historically factual, or at least it is to be interpreted in a more objective and naturally contextualized ways. A senatorial historiography that was the most adverse to the attempts of centralization of monarchic power in favor of other strata of the populations, of the people, the provincials, and so on, and that instead, was a very functional policy for the empire, the one that at the end of the day prevailed for the sake just of controlling this enormous asset that the empire had become. And in the case of Caligula, especially, the sources that wrote about him have also, as we'll see, overall this negative undertone, but the most important ones are definitely very biased, and especially very late, just even compared to his own between 180 years after. And we can't give it the credit that we're trying to, for the picture that we're trying to delineate. And this is a topic I, in fact, addressed already. Some of you said, talk about the Julio-Claudians. Well, we arrived to this point. Naturally, we will make more videos about Caligula specifically and all the Roman emperors. That's what we, we're planning to cover in our series about Roman history. So, as a bit of context, of course, reading the sources, there is this constant negative connotation of the Julio-Claudians in a way or another. These had been the dynasty that had finally enforced essentially a monarchical reality in Rome. Augustus was the founder of an order that nobody really dared to criticize, if not, very tangentially, because of the evident respect and achievements that this enormous figure in the history of mankind had managed to do. But there is the idea that there's a bit of the historiographical cliche there that from the perfection of Augustus, let's say, at least in formal institutional terms, there is the decline towards the degeneration towards tyranny of the Julio-Claudians, and in fact, how they were fundamentally eliminated. And we have this characterizations as, Tiberius, the diabolical hypocrite who hides his plans to disorient those around him. Caligula, in fact, the crazy monster. Claudius as imbecile and debauched, as cruel as inept. Nero, the histrion, right? This is just, a very biased presentation. One, first of all, wonders how the Roman Empire could last and prosper so much as it was doing at the time with such men at the top, right? And the awareness that the ancient testimonies are biased or of senatorial inspiration pushes us to reject the news received as false, tendentious, and slanderous. This is not a matter of personal opinion. Of course, Roman history is somewhat popular, right? But the historiographical understanding maybe is pretty, we like to quote ancient sources as if they were the authority there, but fundamentally not. And we know how they worked, right? And we can't even be angry at them. We should be thankful. In the first place, we have them, whatever they wrote, because that's freaking amazing. We have them. There was a lot more, and there was definitely a process of destruction. The sources, under Caligula, a lot was being written about his life from his family members and so on, other historiographers that went lost in part. So we live in this obscurity, but we can't grasp important information there that actually outline the figures of remarkably capable rulers in their own regard. And however, there is also the inherent risk of switching from supine, let's say, uncritical acceptance of the ancient, betrayed to an a priori reevaluation of the characters in question, to the point of making Caligula, for example, or Nero as enlightened rulers ahead of their time, benefactors of humanity. They were also human rulers, right? And the only way forward in this process is the screening of the sources with a comparison between the texts and the primary documentation. Hence, it emerges that historiography has, of course, sometimes exaggerated or misunderstood even, because certain sources were even just too distant to have any, animosity that we know, politically speaking, existed at the time for reasons that are pretty, macroscopic in Roman history, imperial times. But let's say that if it agrees on the essential, this means that such were or at least we should, accept, because that's the only thing we have, the characteristics of the principes in the private sector, the private sphere. This is, now I won't digress on the, the philosophy of history, of methodology issues, let's say, but it's important for times like this to acknowledge literally what's the amount of sources we have and how therefore should handle them. And as I was saying before, just for the fact that we have them, we have to go by them. There is no other way, right? So either you deny a priori, even in fact, that this is true, or you say, well, if this was written at the end of the day, yes, we have to take it critically, but it's also the only things we know. So we also have to accept this. And looking at the Roman court at the time, well, the power, struggles were exhausted, let's say, between courtiers, senators, certain prominent knights. The equites had an important, role in this balance as well. Sometimes also involving the provincial governors before, also, belonging to the aforementioned orders. As we'll see in Egypt, this was evident with the secessionist revolt to the local prefect, Caligula, dispensed of. But also the institutions were not so affected. Let's say that the bureaucratic administrative machine conceived by Augustus marched regularly throughout this time. The circles outside the capital remain indifferent, at least to these court plots, right? What was going on there? They were interested naturally in the specific figures to rule. Well, Caligula was very well received by the people and by the provincials, but of course they didn't have much of an interference in these factors directly. It was not their business in the first place. The indignant reactions that the sources sometimes register are rather the result of also literary and artistic re-elaboration. So even what was actually happening in Rome at those levels is not entirely clear. Now, common to the first century emperors is the fear of losing the throne. This simply because the only fault objectively of the Augustan system was the lack of a defined succession system that couldn't be conceived given the nature of the imperium proper. Couldn't become dynastic at that point. It was already a big deal to have been balanced the way it did. As we'll see, there is a tendency from these emperors, in fact, to push towards centralization of power, and this is what actually triggered the senatorial resistance against it, and the resulting historiographical work. Power has, say, various methods to maintain itself, from seeking an agreement with the Senate, which, all function together. I mean, to demagogic and populist openness, right? This mostly worked like that. I mean, the main problem was the emperor favoring the lower, the middle classes, the lower classes, the provincials, against the senatorial elite, right? Also, now I want to even discuss like how in popular culture we have depicted certain, I mean, these people, even from, there are popular works, shows, things like that about Caligula, Claudius. First of all, let's realize where they come from political culture, and let's get rid with probably the single most hypocritical political acknowledgement is the one of tyranny, in the sense of the tyrant, the only, there is an evil guy at the top that is so evil, and all the others are poor victims of it, because it's never like this in practice. The tyrant here, if anything, was the closest to the people, right? Because what stood in between was the oligarchy, that was effectively the one that ruled, right? And in this state is being created, and its imperialistic means, the monarch also represented the center, of course, but had to float over these stands, right? It was this accurate balance that Augustus had perfectly calibrated, in a sense, and then from Tiberius to Caligula, Claudius began to be more altered, so much that the Flavian dynasty would come, in fact, from a completely different background with other policies. Albeit even in here we don't have to stress too much differences, such as, thinking that the senators or the knights were concretely seeking for something different. I mean, everybody wants to reach power, and this alleged republicanism or monarchism from both sides is like just back in the day, the optimates and the populares is an illusion. They all wanted to achieve the same thing. They all wanted to become the monarch. They didn't give a damn about what we think like today as republican or democratic values. We're talking about 2,000 years ago. I mean, political theory, philosophy, society, we were something completely different from today. Certain things had not been achieved yet. The Roman Empire was a fiercely and proudly aggressive and imperialistic entity that drove its own prestige and fit of civilization over this, systematically devastating, conquest and subjugation, and that was the only moral standards that existed universally at the time, from the smallest tribe to the ecumenic empire. That was the only possible horizon for any person's mind, right? Things were starting to change now, but, well, Christianity was already there, and that would importantly, start to, say things like, such as that slaves are human beings, right? Before, nobody had ever thought anything like that. So never think that you can understand better this world than those people did, right? We don't. But the nature of monarchic power in here is functional to the maintenance of that world, right? And it's not, just as the events of these emperors get basically almost all assassinated, prove, like the fact that they could be overthrown. So it was not such irreversibly impositive system. No, they were struggling for power just like everybody was doing in any own regard. This is how politics has always been working. So in general, faced with the first signs of the Fronde, since it was impossible to please everyone, the Principatus was perched on positions of vigilant defense and pursuing of the subversives with reflexes of despotism, right? And as we were saying before, despotism was what everybody here was trying to reach in one way or another. the oligarchs work like that. The other people tend to make a living, but they had their own slaves, they had their own households. The world functioned exclusively like that. Like the modern Republican democratic myth is an 18th century invention. It has no factual reality in the way we have interpreted history in the previous times. At this point in the early empire, the crime of lèse-majesté, right, of attempted to wrongdoing against the majestas, is back in vogue. Definitely, is interpreted as, in fact, the emperor's lèse-majesté, right? The individual rulers, which is much easier to prove than the lèse-majesté of the Roman people, right? Because that was also how, what was invoked, in fact, to assassinate these rulers since Caesar. And so the problem of tyranny, that of course the Romans looked at, the Hellenistic world, dreaded in theory. Why? Because it was just an oligarchy that didn't want a monarchy, but they basically wanted to do the same. And indeed, it sounded in the primitive formulation of it, right? The revival of the scheme of the good principality at the beginning, for example, that then yields to tyrannical inclinations, which is a bit for the Julio-Claudians, should not be dismissed hastily as a literary cliche. It mostly reflects the real course of things. Why? Because of these threats, right? If somebody's going to take you out with a conspiracy, you're going to act against it. And here we're not talking about, in fact, once again, of the modern concept of leadership, where there's a guy who's elected, who's there, everybody speaks. No, a Roman emperor thinks to be Jupiter himself, like Caligula did. These people were overloaded with the absolute religious, military scale of authority and self-empowerment that a ruler like a Roman couldn't exclude in any sense, because the world functioned like that. If you came to the throne of the Roman Empire that has conquered literally the whole world, it's because divine glory has chosen you as the most powerful man on earth. These people all over the ancient world were literally and radically and violently obsessed with the myth of Alexander the Great, of world conquest. There was, as I was saying before, no other possible horizon. You rule because you have divine power, because mortals cannot rule but by the divine imperium. And the Romans especially were obsessed by the let's say, the mission, the fact, the idea that the Roman people was the chosen one. Remember that there is no other people in world history after the Jews that believed to be the chosen one. The Carolingians were also a bit like that, following the example of the Jews and the Romans. But these people truly believed that Rome's destiny was to conquer the universe, and there was no doubt. The Romans never processed the fact, not even cognitively, that it could be the other way around, right? And these were the top guys. These were the imperial family, were the blood of those that the glory of the sky had blessed them with the rule of the world. I mean, this psychological acknowledgement is something that can you even imagine what it means to grow with that realization? Even if, in the case of Gaius Caligula, that is emblematic, things went dramatically wrong at the beginning, especially, and those are also not things that you're gonna forget, and that also may explain his behavior quite well, honestly, and with some, maybe not justification, but sound motivation. But do you have an idea what it means to the burden of the responsibility, right, of being a Roman emperor? It's something unspeakable, right? And of course we live in societies that do not because they're too weak to believe that those were the top carry the greatest burden of all, right? These people were much more real, and they knew perfectly well that that was the case. But of course, if you think of, in populistic sense, in this parasitic idea of tyranny, because the people are the good ones, and, just know that the people back these guys with all themselves, right? Because they were from their side, and they were used to counterbalance the oligarchs, by the way. But just that this is a modernistic delusion that doesn't find space, but not even in our own times, right? So let's get rid of this delusion that individual people compared to the world matter something, right? Because it's not the case. It's never been the case in history. Unfortunately, I'm not saying it's something good or bad. I'm just saying that it works like that. And that was a world that faced you much more directly with the evidence of it. So Gaius, as we should be call him, in fact, more properly, was the only male survivor of Germanicus. Hell of a burden there, as his father's legacy. And he owed the nickname famously to the Caligula, the military shoehorn in the wanderings within armies following his parents when he was a child in Germany. I mean, he was dressed up like with the legionary armament in small scale for a child, and the troops that loved Germanicus kind of looked at his son and given him this little bud nickname. Here we will have to talk this in a video about Tiberius, but you know how the story went. Gaius had witnessed the extermination of his family by Tiberius and Sejanus. The great-grandmother Livia and grandmother Antonia, here and there, hell of women, right? In terms of capabilities and legacies and pride, had raised him. Roman women were radically important. Roman society, as they had to nurture the next generation of Romans. The days of wars is typical bit of the militaristic tribal legacy of Rome. And until Tiberius had wanted Gaius with him in Capri, in the island of Capri, where he had retired, also abandoning Rome, giving a bit, more of, steam in that sense to senatorial power in the capital in an anti-Julian sense, right? Tiberius was a man of contradictions in a time of contradictions, we could say, and the problem revolving around, in fact, the Augustan legacy of the empire, how to handle the imperium, this enormously burdensome thing that was crushing for a single man. And from the events of a childhood and a youth full of dangers, because he risked to be exterminated, and he had probably to conceal even, you can imagine the bitter feelings for his parents' death, his brother's death, by the way. Gaius had learned to get by. Nothing would have cancelled it, though. Those are not things you can erase from a young mind like that. Not even from an older one. But that probably structured him. That probably gave him, over the years, a boost in a mindset and an attitude that would surely influence his imperial rule eventually. But prudent conduct, in this sense, could mean omnipotence, in fact. And when Tiberius died in March 37 in Misenus, Gaius collected his ring as a symbol of power. And the evil ones insinuate that with Macro, that facilitated Tiberius' death by suffocating him with a pillow. But, Caligula would have risen more speedily, as the people had already acclaimed and fundamentally knowing of Tiberius' illness. But let's say this is also a bit of a story, because Tiberius was going to be 79, 77, I don't remember, years old soon. It was already a big deal to survive up to that point. And Caligula was a co-heir at the time with the son of Drusus Minor, Tiberius Gemellus, but because Tiberius had designated them fundamentally as heirs. But in what direction the sympathies the tumultuous people showed, who in fact forced the Senate to designate him as sole successor without taking into account the testamentary disposition of the deceased. In fact, Tiberius Gemellus would be disposed of at a certain point, together with others, but we'll see how that happened. I'd say that the myth of Germanicus reverberated on Gaius. Germanicus' premature death had fueled the illusion of the optimus princeps among the people. Those who die young have no time and no way to disappoint expectations. Displaying pietas erga omnes and a desire for reconciliation, Gaius paid the honors to Tiberius without, however, divinizing him. Adopted and appointed his cousin Princeps Juventutis originally. Also rendered solemn honors to the ashes of his mother and brother who died in exile. His mother had starved to death. The others were killed. And rendered his honors to his 3 sisters. There was a great expectation for this emperor that we can't quite understand where he was disappointed on the long run. Because, as we were saying before, the narrative that we received to resources is that at a certain point he changed, right? Tradition does speak of this turning point in the middle of the reign, which makes it, I would say, impossible to really understand, right? The cause might have been a serious illness that he was struck by in autumn 37, which would have undermined his nervous system and brain, exacerbating the consequences of the epilepsy that tormented him since childhood. Like, even here we can't be sure, but he couldn't swim because also, you had to take care of an epileptic if he's, in the line of succession. You can't make him swim in open sea. He had talks with the moon, which was connected to these things. Actually, epilepsy was also Caesar suffered. There was this kind of even there of idea of divine touch. In fact, in Greek, epileptos means he was chosen, right? This is also in tribal cultures, like the guy who has these kind of trance experiences, right, where he loses consciousness and he enters in this other supernatural world. This might have fueled his own beliefs about being a chosen one. He's told to have quarreled with Jupiter himself, saying, once he was scared by thunders and so on, so Jupiter taunts, he couldn't look at the spectacle, so he allegedly said to Jupiter, it's either you or me, either you stop or you kill me or whatever. So that tells you how, in the monarchic perspective, how highly he thought of himself, as it would be normal already for a Julio-Claudian dynasty at that point, but we will see also because of certain influences they surely received from other political models. But we don't have to think of him necessarily as an Hellenist for the sake of it, right? There's a bit too many mechanism in this, too much mechanism in the sense that everybody who looked favorably at the ruler model of the East would have been kind of an anti-Roman, the ancient, even anti-Antonian, in fact, Octavian's propaganda. Things are much more delicate in there, and there was much more syncretism than we think. But surely Caligula had a very fascinating mindset. He knew what he wanted in his way. He was very driven in that. Another cause, maybe a con-cause, can have been the death of his favorite sister Drusilla in 38. You have to understand even here how he had been raised with this constant sense of insecurity of his future, for his life, and therefore his sisters were probably, especially Drusilla, was very close to, and there were the peers would look at each other, same blood, and saying, we got through this, in a sense. Guy loses his mother also that way, this might have affected his psyche. In fact, he had, at least to historiographers, that of course we can't take as factual evidence, but he had discomposed manifestations of mourning on that occasion that seemed not compatible with normal emotional reactions. But even in there, who are we to tell what a Roman emperor would feel like morally? Do you have his mindset? It's very difficult to tell. He deified her, and this fits, however, with a broader political action. We mostly read these stories as if they were personal gossip, but everything a Roman emperor does is political. It is intentionally political, right? And Caligula's reign can be interpreted as this constant defense against senatorial threat and conspiracies. Because in all this, his illness is thought also to have been caused possibly by an assassin attempt, which would explain the paranoia displayed, at least according to the sources, by the young emperor. Youth is also important. The West drew an enormous set of values and significance, let's say, from, as we were saying, from the Alexandrian model, right? Youth was meant from the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Think about the former Gaius and Drusus, Octavian's heirs, as they had literally the youth embodied, right? And there is this, as Germanicus had been, by the way, so this actually ferocious, physical, warlike individuality of conquerors, right? And there is to say, as we will see here, that also Gaius' father's figure was something that he had not been, because he, as we will see, wouldn't pass through the cursus honorum before becoming emperor. He had unregulated youth from that point of view. He was not a general. He was not a military man in that sense. So he probably felt this. He had some complex regarding to it. Others believe also that these are stories that are, really fictional, like that his madness, alleged madness, because I personally don't think he was produced by a poculum amatorium, that is an aphrodisiac potion brought to him by the fourth and last wife, Milonia Caesonia, in wrong doses. The dilemma remains as to whether he was really mad. The fear of lightning, thunder, as we were saying before, was already Tiberius's one, for example. That of losing the throne, common to all the Julio-Claudians. And we have seen how it was even justified, given the incidents of such overthrows. The taste for jokes, even the biting ones, the bitter ones, and for double meanings that may have fueled, also this attitude that towards the senators was evidently, from a historiographical point of view, reflecting the resentment that this class had towards an emperor that wanted to prove an over-rulership over the same senate. In fact, think about the idea of making consul his favorite horse, Inclitatus, right? That he wasn't crazy. That's actually brilliant. That tells you, look, that if I want, I'm emperor. I own the imperium given me by the skies. I can do whatever I want, and you are no one so much. I can make a horse senator and consul even. The consul owns the imperium, right? And the Romans were pretty obsessed with horses, in spite of what it seems, right? And they had actually an equestrian military mindset. That was a symbol of something that went beyond. It goes back to the root of rule in the Roman model, and the individuality of it. The equites back in the day were these exception to the Roman citizen, soldier rule, because it was literally somebody who received an extra from the state and therefore from the gods for his mounted service. So his horse showed in front of the Senate like that, as a young emperor would say, "You do not mess with me," right? And he proved that by taking out several people that surely had involvements against him. There are also the alleged talks, even intimate ones, with gods and goddesses. That is normal, right? We know that even Scipio, before becoming the Africanus, had these talks with, on Capitoline Temple, and that was normal in a sense for those like that Augustus that had received the auspices of the god in there to have this spiritual dimension. This was twisted in the senatorial historiography as a sort of bizarre attitude, but for those time standards, it would have not been even so strange, and he would have been actually the most fitting person for that. Surely he also dressed as different gods, Apollo, Mars, but even Venus. Like there is also the sexual dimension, like you think about the pageantry of this, this incestuous intercourse with sisters that sources insist in, disordered sexual appetites for males and females. This would be normal accusations in Roman political propaganda. It was done all the time. It was done by Octavian to Antony and vice versa. The worst is that people believe them today. Like we know that this, like in the Middle Ages, this was normal accusation. So maybe the guy was close with his sister, and this was transmuted into incest. There's all the story in there, also circumstanced with how this happened, but how would these historiographers know in the first place? The idea that he was sexually dissolute. I mean, the Romans were some, contrarily wise even to how other historiography has written, were some of the most morally strict peoples in the world out there for sexual customs, right? And the reason why there is such recurrency for, when you want to attack someone, even in the Christian Roman Empire, for example, looking at the pagans, is exactly that was the deal, right? Everybody was concerned with these things, even for public reasons, because you couldn't, it was against the divinity to commit incest, so that was an enormous political weapon against a person. But we know it was normally used, and people that are kind of dumb still believe today that what you read in these sources is kind of, it's true because those were a bunch of degenerates. This is not how the world worked at the time. It's not that these people wouldn't commit such acts, or they weren't they were sexually chaste or everything. No, but the information contextualized in these sources is obviously biased, and there is nothing to be surprised of. Everything can be explained, in our opinion, in the light of the circumstances. And there is more. There is a lot. There is, for example, the economical issue. It was said that at the death of Tiberius, the Roman treasure, something like 2,700 billions sesterces, that basically Caligula would have squandered them all in just 2 years. There are other stories that Nero said that he admired his uncle for having doing that in such a few time. These extravagant expenses, he mostly to pay the army, the people. That is something actually that even Octavian had done. It was a clever move, especially for a neo-elected emperor with that position. And there is no proof, though, that he squandered all his money. When Claudius was raised to the throne after Caligula's assassination, we know that he had enough money to pay actually a freaking lot of money to the Praetorians, 15,000 sesterces per each. So we know that the means over the empire kept working throughout all Caligula's reign. So there is no proof whatsoever that, just imagine you have this 4 years emperor, you can't just write about yourself because there is no press, there's no scientific, public, systematic, prolific public opinion written documentation about that. You can write everything you want. He also spent a lot of money in infrastructures, which is what an active emperor would like to do at the time, to improve even centralized income and so on. He completed Pompey's theater, for example. Nero's circus actually was started by Caligula. The Claudian aqueduct, in fact named after Claudius, was started by Caligula, and also another, the Anius Aqueduct. He made this impressive bridge in the Gulf of Baia. He built this massive... he also is recorded to have, in fact, spent enough money for himself, his own rule, but that might have actually been for the sake of the monarchy at that point. The famous Nemesis ships, these enormous floating palaces, basically, even with vineyards, thermae, everything on the, they existed out there. They were destroyed in 1944 by the Germans. But this shows a grandeur that would be politically typical of a, affront to the oligarchy that had tried to mitigate, especially during the last years of Tiberius' reign, the imperial power in the city. And that now this young kid who had not even went through the cursus honorum, right? Tiberius actually kept him out from it, but that was at least the result. Who was he to tell senators what they had to do, what they didn't have to do? So this explains the friction, the important strength that existed between these elements of Roman society. Gaius did not know also what it meant to hold an empire of that size in practice. He had to learn, at least, very quickly. That is a factor that must be recognized. I mean, he had not been habituated to rule since an early age, so he had to make up for it. And these extravagances, may fit also in this attempts to boost also ideologically, propagandistically his power in situations that were more risky. But let's say that he personally also ascertained what power the emperor held. So even his capacity to space within these boundaries, between these extremes, well, says that he was not so ignorant in the political reality altogether, so that he would push that to the limit, testing this limit and expanding his understanding. There is also another element to consider, as we were hinting at before, that Gaius was formed in the Antonian family environment that influenced him a lot, and that made him lean towards Hellenistic monarchy. That Antony, it was all this branch of the descendants from Cleopatra that were eventually raised in Rome, in Italy at least, and eventually placed by the Romans in these various client states, either in the east or in Africa. And Gaius had been raised with these people that naturally had a very different idea of monarchy. The Roman one, as we've seen, was still relatively, it was oligarchic fundamentally in nature, right? The idea of the republic as the sum of still tribal system held by the heads of the clans, right? It was still democratic in comparison to the millenary ecumenic monarchies of the East, of Egypt, of Persia, and so on. And these kids were naturally raised with the idea of being, having also this massive show. That the Romans themselves, Augustus himself, that in Rome was just the first among equals, namely that even if in practice it wasn't like that, but in Egypt he was represented like a pharaoh. It was absolutely normal. But Gaius was raised with these kids. I would think to be the sons, the son embodied, right? These are all, there is this sense of grandeur and of, absolutism over a people like the one in the Nile Valley was used to this from millennia, that wouldn't manifest too much, let's say, deviances from that order. So the idea of a sovereign as a god on earth that the Romans still had. They had gone with divinization, but after that, but it was something particular also related to the body of, to the idea of the spirit raising up close to the gods because of the merits of the virtue that was connected to that military capacity of the Imperial. We were saying before, if you look at the Cursio, the funeral of Roman emperors, it was strongly connected still with this Indo-European mentality of this was similar actually, but it let's say embodied, let's say, an omnipotent rule that was free from the laws, which we can't know how much Caligula would have been influenced by practically, but it surely gave him, let's say, food for thought in order how to humiliate the senators that surely reciprocated and maybe had actually started, ideally, the thing. So Gaius, however, felt very much his role, right? He might have been intoxicated by the position reached, especially if you have spent your youth basically fearing you would be taken out from a moment to another. You wouldn't expect to become emperor so easily. We know that it was at least all this. I mean, Tiberius factually spared his life, contrarily to others he had killed, and he appointed him as successor. There is all this idea that the young Caligula would have liked to assassinate Tiberius in that time, and that he knew it, but still, the thing was mitigated. Here we also have to consider really a legitimate concern for the empire, for the imperial succession, for this thing of the monarchy, and the fact that, broadly speaking, the Julio-Claudians were surely an important clan within itself that would recognize its self-perpetuation as a mean of stability at the end of the day. So naturally this was complicated because these were different bloods. I mean, Tiberius wasn't a Julio-Claudian, right? He was just adopted, but biologically it was another story. All these others descended basically from Octavian's daughter, sister, and Mark Antony, and that's what basically Julio-Claudians were about. They were married within each other. Gaius wanted for himself the title of Pater Patriae that Tiberius had declined when it was offered by the Senate, because Tiberius was, had strained relation with his adoptive father, but he had enough respect for Augustus for, let's say, realized that what he had done, it was definitely intimidating. That was something so great that he didn't quite buy it fully for himself, right? He couldn't simply succeed to Augustus. You can't be Augustus' successor and say, okay, I'm just the same person. It couldn't be. Augustus was too great by any standard. We're talking about the greatest politician in the history of mankind. He had a vision, that this incredible authoritative persona, right? That the Romans were extremely concerned with, and Gaius felt instead his lineage, felt very much. So he disliked to descend from Agrippa. That was his grandfather, and unfortunately for him, even from coins, he was kind of identical to him. At least, he looked very similar to him, and he even spread allegedly rumors that he was not the son of Julia and Agrippa, but actually of an incest, in fact, of Augustus with his daughter, just to say that he would descend properly from Augustus himself. So he definitely wanted to take that legacy on him, right? And this is typical of a person that surely is struggling for that kind of power, that wants to assume every kind of possible means to augment the authority of his persona under that divine legacy of the empire. There was this drama of the terrible past in his life, the prospect of being able to suddenly fall off to the explained, that motivated, at least in part, his lack of balance. he is being excessive in every attitude, as the authors say. But once again, this may be as well just also an exaggeration. The theocratic conception of power could arise from the Eastern cult of the emperor god, right? Also, incest might be a reference to the Egyptian tradition of the marriage between brother and sister to keep the blood of the lineage uncontaminated, let's say. And this almost biological, is allegedly eugenetic, because we know, of course, that that is not good blood at all, right? It brings a lot of sickness, genetic problems in the first place, but might have at least inspired the story of the incestuous relationships, especially with Drusilla, dating back to his youth and continued under the death of his sister, right? He might have seen her as a possible heir of the heir to the throne. And he was, in fact, very jealous of his sister's husband, allegedly. But even in here, the Romans were so prudent at that time, were so obsessed with moral issues, that these stories thrown around are definitely also a way to calumniate the emperor in this pattern. See, that's the deprived Eastern guy that is not a true Roman, is just crazy, obsessed, despot with his, tyrannic tendencies. What the hell do we know, after all, right? Other rumors were spread of course, the tendency to profit from the wives of senators, subjected to his capricious desires. Some married and soon repudiated. That would signify the paranoia of absolute power, right? Because Romans, as we were saying, even in marital affairs, were formally, publicly very, very concerned, especially from a political point of view. Let's say that the events of 39 brought him back to reality when he realized that after, far from continuing to idolize him, the Romans had enough, some excesses of him, as it seems Charisty to have caused important problems in the empire. This may have actually been the cause of historiography saying that he had sent the empire bankrupt, but there is not enough evidence for it. There was a conspiracy of Cornelius Lentulus Gaius, governor of Germany, that was connected with the senatorial circles of Rome, and also involved the widower of Drusilla, Aemilius Lepidus, and the sisters of Caligula, Agrippina Minor and Livilla. Agrippina was, Nero's mother, as you know. Livilla was, anything more than an immature and a bit foolish girl, let's say. But Agrippina was instead a hell of a person. She was very determined, played her cards to ensure the succession of her son, born in December 37 of Domitius Aenobarbus. And for this reason, she was tied to her brother-in-law Lepidus, whom her widowhood put out the Imperial game, right? And Gaius and Lepidus were put to death that occasion. Caligula spared instead the lives of his sisters, merely exiling them with, allegedly sadistic humiliations. That year's conspiracy is very meaningful because it shows, if anything, Caligula's controlled power at the end of the day, right? In all this considered, Caligula's foreign policy is also fascinating, right? He played well his cards, for example, in the East. He used his, he was very friend with the Jewish monarch, whom he had been raised with as well, and that he sent to Egypt to tame a revolt to the local Roman prefect that was exploiting secessionistic movements in Egypt. Egypt, had been made by Augustus a province under the direct control of the emperor through a prefect. So we are with the most direct control because of the obvious importance of grain supplies coming to Europe from the Nile Valley. It was an extremely important asset, and that move was smart. Caligula was fueling also the ambitions of the Jewish monarchs to kind of impose the Hellenistic way in the empire. He had this huge statue of himself built in the Temple of Jerusalem. This triggered the Jews. It was a revolt. Herodotus managed actually to put it down, convincing Caligula not to intervene with the army. But Caligula also paid a lot of money to for example, the Commagene kingdom, so probably securing the eastern border at that point. Caligula, we're not very well documented. A lot has been written in his time about it, but we lost the sources. He started the annexation of Mauritania. Actually, it would be completed under Claudius. It was a smart move. He basically invited his second cousin, that was the king of Mauritania, in Rome, and had him killed. So he annexed Mauritania, also provincialized the country, split in two provinces. That was a smart move because after Tiberius' times, Tacfarinas revolt, the African frontier had seemed to be unstable, so that secured an important stability for the African provinces. That also brought grain from Tunisia as well, not just from Egypt. Egypt was another thing like that. There was another world in a sense. But that was an important move. Also, often Caligula is ridiculized for his British campaign, Britannic campaign, because he seemingly never launched, but that would have actually been carried out by Claudius, famously enough, and this might have been an important move. Augustus had wanted to invade Britain. He probably sent this explorative force. They made jokes about this fact, but probably the Romans did enter Britain and had received an assurance of submission, had always been basically since Augustan times, but even from Caesar times, it basically tamed the interventions of the Britons in Gaul. He was stationed in Germany, and he had even in there a clash with the senators that accused him of failure, and instead he was allegedly fighting. So it might have been actually an important expedition at the time. Sources are very vague, but there might have been a tribute that the Britons paid once again, and the Romans also stationing in Britain for some time. We just don't know, but we know how eventually things unfolded. That was Caligula's attempt to come back on his father's footstep in Germany, where his family had been tied to because of campaigns that launched there, and quashing the shame of Teutoburg. The story of him allegedly ordering to collect, legionnaires to collect shells on the Channel shores to claim loot over the seas. Right? It's not more than a joke, than a story. I mean, why would it be real? Right, knowing the literature and how it worked, why would it be real in the first place? And secondly, but that's simply a misinterpretation of the same passage. Actually, that the source neither says that, but there is the story, I think, in Claudius that was reverberated, and then it's completely devoid of foundation. So, still imagine after the 39 conspiracy, the emperor feeling alone, betrayed by his own family, right? Macro, that has been seen, had been supported him. Tiberius times, also Tiberius Gemellos had already been eliminated for futile reasons in 38, but still, effectively for that matter. But there is this broader possibility, in fact, that he was actually about to launch proper a Germanic campaign, and even a landing in Britain hadn't riots broke up in Alexandria in Egypt because of clashes between the Greeks and the Jews, and with the latter pogroms and the sending of embassies to Caesar himself. For example, Appian for the Hellenes and Philo for the Jews. In fact, those are also part of the sources we have about him. So even in there, we see actually an ambition of launching major-scale military expeditions of conquest in the far north, along the footstep of his father, right? Germany, that had all that past for the Julio-Claudians, and that, let's say, the ransoming of the Roman honor. Britain as literally the province that eventually the Romans would be proud of boasting the conquest, because they said these are the limits of the world. There's so much that not even the gods in the mythologies have ever come to Britain, but we Romans did, right? And at that point it tells you the scale of ambitions of a Roman emperor, an ecumenic rule. And these campaigns would have been launched probably in summer 40. Caligula also escaped a conspiracy in the same year, right? And he would be taken, however, by surprise, definitely on January the 24th of 41, in the hallways of the palace, by officials of the Praetorium, fearful for their lives, because now that sentences were following one another, and for even a shadow of a suspicion, and in league with the senators and the knights. Even here, Caligula had partly favored the Equites, had created a lot of them. He had formally restored certain popular assemblies. He did, from an administrative point of view, he did a lot actually. He eliminated the centesima rerum venalium there was this 1% tax. It was mostly for popular reasons. He published all the accounts of the Tiberian times had been, rendered private to hide the business of the senators. He actually enforced some laws on morality against sexual perversions. He made interesting laws, especially in the first year, in the first phase of his reign. Then eventually, he was said that allegedly when he ran out of money, he began to speculate in other ways to take out political rivals, to seize their properties and all this stuff. But we still see, for example, he put taxes on gambling. There is a pattern there that is always kind of against the abuses of the oligarchy. That, for example, if in the previous census was seen to have acquired too much, would confiscate their goods. Here's all listed as if he eventually put them to death and committed these cruelties. But it does make a sense, politically speaking, economically speaking, the provision in itself. He also controlled the abuses of centurions that basically had seized pieces of land during the conquests for themselves without permission. Something that makes you see an order, after all, and an attention for generally speaking, for the middle class, right? He wanted to open the Isthmus of Corinth, which eventually Nero would start. I think there are various things of that magnitude, right, that he started, and that is really important, right? He completed a lot. He completed the Temple of Augustus as well, right? So he was assassinated in this way. The thing was very brutal because eventually the plot didn't quite work, right? The senators wanted to restore the Republic in a way, but the plan failed. First of all, the plotters were killed largely. Even some innocent senators were killed by the Germanic Guard and others. But also this conspiracy took place in several places. For example, Caligula's his body was taken away, burned, buried in a place of Rome. Eventually would be reassumed and given the proper honors. But for example, his wife Caesonia was killed by a centurion. The little daughter Drusilla was also smashed against the wall. That's how they did the thing, right? Sad, especially with all these political interests were involved. It was brutal. And the Senate actually asked, or better, actually decreed the damnatio memoriae of the same emperor, but Claudius, that was put on the throne by the Praetorians that occupied the capital of the Senate, actually put a veto on it, and therefore kind of that also speaks for his, the respect of the continuity of his nephew, because actually Claudius was one of the very few that Caligula didn't take out of his relatives, because he wanted to make him allegedly an object of mockery, because that Claudius was kind of couldn't speak well. He was already, since Augustus' times, was seen as kind of an imbecile. And even in there, you have to understand what that means, right? In a world where you have to be perfect because you have to be the next ruler of the world, even a person that had maybe speech difficulties, that in the case of Claudius at least would boost him to read a lot, to interiorize a lot. In fact, he was one of the great Roman philosopher emperors, let's say, together with the same Augustus, by the way, and Marcus Aurelius. Well, had allegedly spared him because, in fact, of the fact is just to mock him, allegedly. Right, and in the same Julio-Claudian family, Claudius had been already emarginated like that, and the fact that Claudius, however, acted after all in favor of his nephew is also an important aspect of this. Partly, Caligula's acts, however, were before the veto were revoked and his name erased from descriptions. This is also bad for us, historically speaking, of course, because we know less. But that speaks for the hatred, naturally, of the senators for him. That is still an historical reality, and that makes us, see even better that the bias was there. So, indeed, we will come back on the figure of Caligula because he's really interesting. But we will talk more in detail about all these things. This was just an introduction, but definitely you have always to interpret. I mean, the more an emperor tried to centralize, to do without the senators, very often favoring the middle class. Think about Nero's monetary reforms. Those favored heavily the middle class, and they lasted until Diocletian. Right, it was a hell of a reform. Nero was actually another very good emperor on many grounds. Right, he did crush the party, and so he made a lot of infrastructural work. But there's always the same pattern. The guy is a terrible, depraved, monarchic, Hellenistic tyrant, and with monarchic tendencies, the Senate is triggered by that, so he's the monster. Right, and even if, of course, at court, there was plenty of these conspiracies and blood. I mean, we have no reason to think they actually kill each other like that, even among relatives. We know pretty damn well this happened more or less everywhere. So what's the version of the story, right? Were this just a bunch of maniacal murderers? Did they have mental problems? It's possible, right? It's perfectly possible. At the same time, were they better than others? Were they worse than others? This we can't really say. And as far as their, governmental policies show, they may have been actually good emperors. They achieved important things. And the case of Caligula, as we've seen, is the least documented, is the guy who lived the shortest, because, by the way, he was assassinated also at 28, 29. It's the most mysterious, it's the most characterized, it's the most depraved also. It's maybe Nero more, actually. But Nero is a bit more charismatic. Caligula is like, in fact, the young little, nuts that wants to be who knows what, right? At least narrative. I mean, this is the narrative that we get from the historiography, right? And instead, he's a figure that must be carefully reevaluated. Of course, historiographically speaking, this is being already done, but in popular culture, even more, and especially, let's get rid, please, of fiction that is being written on and fueling these rumors, because that is not a way of making history. We could add a lot of stuff, actually, about especially the symbolism employed by Caligula to humiliate the Senate. According, again, to biased historiography, it may actually conceal some genial forms. I mean, the episode of the horse is the one of a genius, not a crazy person. Maybe they're both at the same time. I give you that, as often happens, actually. But objectively, there is nothing strange in it having happened given those specific circumstances. And if you look at broadly speaking, the evolution of the Roman monarchy, well, you'll see there fundamentally this imperial power gradually, increasing relative of, and imposing itself on the senators. Like, I don't know, at the time of Domitian, they would even starting to kneel in front in sign of reference, of deference. In Julio-Claudian times, at the times of the Republic, let's say, historiographically meant, because Rome was technically always, even during the Empire, a res publica, which doesn't even mean republic in the modern sense, but something deeper, entailed that reverence to the senators that had been at the base of the balance, especially when we will see better Augustan policies. That's the masterpiece of the balance. In Tiberius' times also there was this swing that was actually dangerous. So you have there an aggressive senatorial element that must be always considered. Why should have not been the monarchy aggressive itself in turn, right? And even displaying, as we've seen today, an important amount of power, even for this young man who ruled only for 4 years. And I'll tell you, to me, he was not a bad ruler. At least for what we can get overall, he made things working like others. And we have no objective reason to think he was a monster, a deviant, or whatever, right? Surely, however, we can't rule that out, but as we can't rule out, how can you describe a person who lived so many years ago in that context and with the information we have? It's very, 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 very difficult, and we perfectly know it. So, for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.